the book party, my first book party, I was supposed to read from The Undertaker's Daughter, and I looked at those poems about my childhood, and I couldn't read them. It was just too painful. And I said, I can't read these poems. That's all there is to it. And it was like I hit a wall, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And then a voice said, just sing them. Most times I liked my food. I didn't mind eating until my daddy started making me clean my plate and either struck me off my chair if I didn't, or lifted me up by my hair and held me midair if I was slow. He wanted me to eat faster. He didn't have all day. He'd hold me off the floor until I pleaded. I'd sputter in fear and humiliation. I don't remember pain, but I had to button up before he put me down to do exactly what he had told me to do. Fast slowness was a sign of insubordination. If I missed a pea or a crumb, I was trying to outwit him. I must have thought he was stupid. And if I pleaded I hadn't seen the pea, he'd know I was lying. Your story is so touching till it sounds like a lie. I swallowed it down. I wiped that look off my face, but still he would notice my bottom lip beginning to quiver. This was a personal insult, as if I had taken a knife and put it to his face. If my brow wrinkled in a question, do you love me, Daddy? How could you hurt me like this? This implied I was pursuing my own version of the truth, as if I were his victim. It was a war of wills, as he so clearly saw, and these were my attempts to subvert him, to make my will reign. He was the ruler of my body. I had to learn that. He had to be deep in me, deeper than instinct, like the commander of a submarine during times of war.
The heart is full of fear, the heart is full of tremble, and still the act is a courageous act.
Toi's not making any of it up, you know, and she is very afraid. She is very afraid. Almost every time she picks up a pen, it is an act of courage for her. And I've known her for a long time, and I've never known her not to be afraid. So I don't understand why she keeps doing it, because I would just stop going there, you know, if it was that terrifying. I think it's an instinct for her to grapple with it, knowing that not only is she going to arrive through on the other end at some point, but she's taking a lot of people with her.
She is such a joyous human being, you know? She is, for all the pain and the, you know, strum and drama she's gone through in her life, it hasn't crushed her. It's actually made her a more joyful person. It really has.
You know, we were talking about yesterday, and you were talking a lot about what it's like to be in the family of a writer. Have you guys ever had that conversation? You know, what do you write, and then do you show your family? Right? Only the good stuff? Now, what's the good stuff? That doesn't mean necessarily your best poems, right? The good stuff. You know, it's hard. It's still hard. And, you know, my mother and dad aren't alive, but they did read some of the stuff that I wrote about my relationships with them in my childhood. And it was rough. My mom was very upset. And we fought about it for a long time. And then at a certain point, you know, I thought, you know, she might disown me and never talk again. But at some point, we just stopped talking about it and went on.
But did they create fear in you too? That could have been part of the
Caution.
Fear. Caution.
Yeah, caution. And I think now, looking back at my father, how hard he was on me. And you call it abuse, I mean, cruelty. But that was what he wanted me to be prepared to bear in my life, to be ready for. And in fact, it worked that way.
You write about Richard Wright's Black Boy being that way, where he was
Yeah.
he was beaten by his mother, and people would say, how could she do that? But I think you understand why she did it.
Yeah, and Robert Hayden talks about that in the poem The Whipping, you know, and the anger in the house that he grew up in Black Bottom, you know. He talks about getting up in the morning to that sense of anger being in the house. Those were hard years for Black people, terrible years. After slavery into the 20s, the 30s, it was terrifying. You know, there were just certain things that these people understood about how they had to be careful in this life. And my parents did want me to know that. And I think they also wanted me to know that we were amazing in that we had survived this.
What Toi does, as very good poets do, is find a way to touch the heart about moral implications that matter very much. And that's why, for me, and I think for many people, reading a book of poems that really works well is an experience that is wonderful, not just as kind of aesthetic thrill. It's not like listening to some Baroque music that you like, although that's very fun, but it's also learning something in the best of possible ways, and learning, in the case of many of Toi's poems, moral significance to behavior that you may not have thought about otherwise, or you may have forgotten about, and all of a sudden, wham, there you are, you're right back with it again.
You know, a lot of my writing is about the difficult parts of being African American, being a woman, gender, class, color, some of the things that we went through in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. But as I get older, I understand how much the people that I grew up with, how hard they struggled and how successful they were, and what wonderful things they knew and gave their family. You know, I took that for granted. I took all the good stuff for granted. And that's interesting how we do that. But I do feel that I always had a question in my mind, you know, why were people unhappy? There were a lot of people in my life who were unhappy. Not to say there weren't these joyous moments, but I did think about, you know, what makes their life so hard? And I wanted to help them a lot of times.
The people are there in your work, but also there's a sense of place. What is the sense of place of Detroit? That's always been in your work. It still is.
Yeah. And when I flew in yesterday, it was one of these days that I remember so well that I have only experienced in Detroit. It's a kind of a sky. I'll start there. You know, the clouds were really high and thick and white and gray, and then above this, the sky was just blue. I haven't seen that in other places, this huge like mountain of clouds, and then the really intense blue sky. Like a great poem is merciless. It was like that, just clear. It also felt like a pressure cooker growing up in Detroit. There was an intensity here, a fire, an energy, a heat. That's what I felt. And the people had a kind of fuel going. There was a fuel here. And I think that image sort of comes from the foundry and the image of the heat in the factories and the boiling steam and we were making something. There was something being made here that was very useful, and everybody was a part of it. There were a lot of problems, you know, But it was also wonderful. I mean, there was music everywhere all the time. You could walk down a street and the window would be open and you'd hear people playing music. Music was such an important part of my growing up. My mother and my aunt always had music on. You know, they'd be listening to Billie Holiday or Perry Como, or I don't know if my family, I don't think they were big readers. We did have books. I was given books when I was very young, and I did really value the books I had. I loved pictures, but I think my interest was sort of a poet's interest in books and in pictures. I think I was interested in images and in thinking in images and in the story.
Were there storytellers in your family?
Oh, yes. Oh, incredible storytellers. My aunt, she would just tell. They were all storytellers, every one of them. My father was a great storyteller. And that is, again, something I took for granted. In fact, I used to wonder why people would tell me the stories they told me. I mean, I'd be 7 years old and people were telling me these terrible stories about growing up in the South and about terrible things that had happened to them. And I would wonder, why are they telling me that? You know, you're not supposed to be telling kids my age these stories. They had a sense of the connection between the past, and they kept that alive. They didn't forget the past, and they wanted their children to remember the past. They didn't, you know, in some ways, if there were certain questions you asked that were personal, they didn't want to talk about necessarily certain aspects of their experience, and they would shut that down. My mother didn't want anybody to know how old she was. Any possible question that would head in that direction would get a very strong rebuke. But they told me all kinds of stories about growing up. So there was a great richness of connection, and you felt responsibility for other people. You felt, you know, when I was 2 or 3 years old, you know, I was helping my aunt clean the kitchen. You know, as soon as I could get up on a stool to help do dishes, it was just a part of your life that people helped other people. You took it for granted.
Your genuine feeling for community is big-hearted. Many times you have thanked various people who helped you, and now you're passing it on. You have been passing it on for a long time to people.
Well, you give what was given to you, right? And so that goes back to my mothers and grandmothers. They did the best they could, and they wanted desperately to make it better for the ones who came after. And that's part of that. You know, maybe everybody's trained this way, but certainly Black people, when I grew up, were trained, you got to help the next one along. That was a caveat. You know, you got to bring the people from the South. You got to make room in your house. You got to share what's on your table. Yeah, who are the people that keep you alive? You know, sometimes families can be devastating, and if you didn't have other people besides your family, sometimes you might not make it. And I was, again, gifted with being a child at a time when every neighbor's house was open, you know, and certain neighbors were just loved you by letting you just come in their house and leaving you alone. The Tuckers across the street, that was the place where all the kids met every day. And, you know, I never really thanked her, but she probably saved my life. And so many people along the way, in little ways, were generous. It matters. I remember a nun who used to let me come sit and talk to her after school. Maybe I was 3rd or 4th grade. 5th grade, a young nun. I don't know what happened to her, but I used to go just sit in her coat room.
What was high school like for you?
I went to Catholic high school, and of course prayer and the music of just the music of the religious songs. You know, I had to go to Mass every day, so I knew everything by heart, and saying the Latin prayers. It was meaningful to me.
It was appreciated if you were there. If you didn't get there, then there was no issue around that, but we made it a point to get there. And it was an important daily occurrence throughout the week. I have no doubt that our faith was very important to each of us.
I took Latin, and the nun, Sister Adelaide, who must have been 90 years old, and she was very thin and she had a creaky little voice, and she would read pages of the Odyssey, you know, in Latin out loud to us. And then I had a teacher later who loved poetry, and she encouraged me to even write poems.
I knew that Toi was very creative, and that whatever she chose to do, she was going to succeed in it. That was very obvious. She was our high school president in senior year, and she was really looked up to by many.
On the one hand, wanted to be a very nice Catholic girl, and all the nuns like me, and on the other hand, I liked to hang out with the bad girls who smoked behind the church for 8 o'clock Mass.
We used to meet after school, and we'd go across Woodward Avenue to this little shop that had like just small items and everything, but they had one area in the front that had a fountain, and you could buy a drink and something like that. So there would be about 5, 6 of us that go over there after school and thinking we were really big, and we would sit there and smoke. But we had great fun in that store, and we shared a lot of things together.
One thing that was mysterious about Kathleen is she always wanted to be a nun. And at the same time she wanted to be a nun, I could talk to her about things that, it didn't mean I had to talk to her about holy things. You know, we could talk about what it was like for me to be me.
She had this depth, but she had this spontaneity. She had the let's have some fun, and that was right after my heart.
There are some people that I just instantly trust and fall in love with, and she was one of them.
We spent time just enjoying each other's company and finding our way.
I was also hooked up with interesting people in Detroit. There were a lot of beatniks during that time. It was a group of black and white people who met at coffee houses and maybe at Wayne State University. They were intellectuals, people who were interested in politics and justice. And I got to fall in with some of these people who were interested in jazz. I mean, this was a very different environment than Girls Catholic Central.
Did you know Naomi Long Madgett at that time?
I did. I knew of her poetry through one of my dear friends, Lotus Joy LaGrone. She was quite an intellectual.
One of the steps toward building this useful life was you went to Wayne State.
Yes.
At that point. And what
Yeah.
were you interested in most?
Well, I was accepted into the convent. I was going to be a nun when I was in high school. And I remember even going out to Monroeville. No, actually, no. They interviewed me at Marygrove. I went to see the Mother General of the Immaculate Heart of Mary Nuns. Something about being a nun, it hit me on a deep level as part of a connection to something spiritual that also was something about poetry, truth and beauty. And a belief in something bigger that we were trying to articulate. But it turned out I was not to be a nun because shortly after that I was pregnant, and then I married after. And during that time, I spent a year at Marygrove, and then I went to Wayne State University. And I went to Monteith. It was part of Wayne State University, but it was done with a grant from the Ford Foundation, and it was very small seminars, maybe 8 people who would study humanities and natural science. Those were your 2 subjects. We had professors who actually weren't professors, they were people in the field. I only had the benefit of it for, I think, 2 years, because I had a child, I needed to get a job right away. So I went right into teaching, got my degree in special education. I married Reese when I was 19, I guess. And I was pregnant, and it was a terrible thing for a middle-class black girl to get pregnant. That was a really bad thing. It ruined your family's reputation. And so I was persona non grata for a while. But Reese, I think the thing about Reese that I enjoyed so much is he was an artist. You know, I met him at the Detroit Institute for the Arts. I was there with a friend of mine, and he was painting, and he started a picture of me, a painting of me. And I just had this feeling about him that he was, I guess, an artist, and I was attracted to him.
He was quite a bit older than her, maybe 15 years older than her. He had just gotten back from a tour in Europe. He was involved in the emancipation of like concentration camps and all kinds of cool stuff, but primarily he was a musician. And he had been touring in Europe with the U.S. Army Jazz Band for, I guess, about 16 years. And came back and just decided he didn't want to play jazz anymore, and had decided to go back to school. He was going to Wayne, I believe, Wayne State. Yeah, and getting his art degree to teach, getting a master's, I think. And he met my mom at a party, and he was very charismatic and very lovable, and you know, sort of had this great flair and very charming. And she fell for him, and little did she know that, you know, he was all the broke artist you would expect.
At the same time, I was driven to be an artist. Now I understand. I was trying to find a way to be an artist. And to be an artist, it looked like everything had to fall apart. Because when I started hanging out with Reese, who was an artist, and I got pregnant, that's what happened. My body changed. I was hiding under a black coat, but I couldn't hide this part of myself anymore. That was not this perfect little Catholic girl. And things fell apart. It was pretty painful.
Started having to deal with so many difficulties of being an unwed Catholic girl. She was 19 years old, and the shame and the guilt around, you know, this pregnancy. And
you were the one that was to blame. God forbid if you would get pregnant. And it was your shame, and it was your family's shame. And so that, and it broke my heart to break my mother's heart. That was the thing. And then Reese didn't have the money to take care of us. I mean, he was painting paintings to try to find a way for us to go away together, and I was going to give my child up for adoption when we went away. And then Reese couldn't take care of me, couldn't support us, and I found a way myself to go away to this home for unwed mothers. And I took a train by myself and went to Kalamazoo, Michigan. I lived with a family for a month and took care of their children. And then I went into a hospital for a month and worked in the laundry, because the pregnant girls, that's what they did to earn their way. They worked in the laundry. And the doctors treated us so mean. You know, there was a Catholic hospital, and there was still that stigma. But during that time, I got a letter from my cousin Sylvia here in Detroit, and she had found out, you know, as the women do find out in the family. And she said, "Don't give your baby up. You'll never be complete again. You'll always wonder where your son is, where your baby is." We didn't know his son at that time. And suddenly I thought, they know. I don't have to hide anymore. And just that letter changed that. And I had fallen in love with my child by that time. I was, 8 months pregnant. So I just wrote this letter, you know, saying, you know, I was going to keep my child.
At one point in time, Toi and her son Tony lived with us. Yes. So that was only for maybe 6 months, maybe a little bit longer.
My father's son is Benjamin Webster Jr., and I call him Jay. His mother called him Jay.
We shared a father. We didn't share a mother, but she's always been just my sister. It's never been anything else but that.
He was born 18 years after me. So Jay came to a delighted father who was closer to 50. And actually when he was born, I was still living at home, and so I was kind of like the big sister. I took him everywhere, and I read him. I wanted to make him an artist, of course, so I was making up stories with him and puppetry. And
as a sister, she's always been there for me. And I've needed her on many different occasions, and she's never ever turned a deaf ear towards me.
I was living in the projects in Detroit, in the Jeffries project on the 14th floor. I lived in the married student housing building, so a lot of the people in the building were still getting their degrees. And there was families, young families.
Living in that project, I remember cement walls and cement floors. But her house was always very tidy and very well kept. But being a kid, I was there to play with Tony.
I was about 3 years old, and I just remember very clearly this apartment that we lived in, the windows that looked out into the projects, the surrounding buildings, the people that looked like little ants running around on the playgrounds and parking lots down there. And I remember tugging on my mom's nightgown. I remember my bedroom. I'm kind of putting myself back mentally in this space so I can kind of get to what it was like, what I remember. I don't remember seeing my father in that space that much.
I remember certain times in my life when my mind actually changed. Something flipped like a flip chart, and I was in another world. It happened like that when I decided my husband had to go. My son was 2. I had been suicidal for months, holding myself back from moment by moment jumping from our 14th floor project window. One morning, I woke up, looked over at him sleeping in the other twin bed, the teen bed I had brought from my mother's house, and I thought, yep, this is it. I got up, dressed to go out to my day job. I was substitute teaching at the time, came back into the bedroom and touched his shoulder. I'm leaving for work. When I come home, I want you to be out of here. I guess he thought that as in the past, such threats indicated we were going to have another fight. But inside me was a new me. You can't make it happen. Slowly, sun up by sun up, new moon by new moon, something changed. Once I asked my mother, how you know it's time for a divorce, and she said, nobody can tell you, but when it's time, you know.
Where did you first teach?
At that time, there were programs for socially maladjusted children. And I did my practice teaching. And I did that at a school right in the center of Detroit that was for boys that had problems. Then I worked for about 4 or 5 years at the Skill Center, the Manpower Skill Center in Detroit, which was a factory that had been turned into a place that in the morning people would study English and math. In the afternoon they would train for jobs. And there were all kinds of job programs, and you were paid to go there. And it was probably one of the most interesting teaching experiences of my life, because these were people who were, you know, anywhere from 18 to 40, you know, and some of them were brilliant, just brilliant. And some couldn't read, and they were brilliant. The rooms were hot with energy and wit and intelligence. It was so vibrant, the atmosphere. I felt that vibrancy all over the city. Anytime a group of black people got together, it was so lively. I mean, I'm not kidding.
So when did you leave Detroit then?
I had known Bruce Derricotte from the time I was, I think, 14 or 15 years old. He had moved to New York and came back to Detroit to visit a friend of his here who was a friend of mine, Clarence Robinson, and we hooked up again and started dating. And
I remember him starting to come by and visit and bring gifts, and he would take my mom away for the weekend, and he had a plane, and he was very successful. He was in Ebony magazine. He was a young bachelor. There was a, you know, one of the most eligible bachelors. And there are photos of him sitting in the cockpit of his plane, looking cool with his glasses on. He was a beautiful guy. He was just what she needed at the time, you know, a loving guy, some security, and they hit it off. And before I knew it, probably a year or so went by, they got married. And we moved to New York shortly thereafter.
Were you writing during all this time?
not really.
Not really.
A little bit, but you know, being a young mother and working full time for years to support my child, and yeah, I didn't have a lot of time to write.
When she got married to Bruce, it broke my heart. I liked Bruce, but he was taking my sister, and I loved my sister, and it was just, every time I'd go to see her, every time that she'd come to see me when she was leaving, I'd fall out and cry. That's how much I love my sister. But I learned to share.
That was a big transition, you know. I was leaving my family behind, leaving my cousins. I have a lot of first, second cousins in Detroit. I was really close with them. And leaving Jay and my grandfather, and it was rough, and my grandmother. But I took it on, and it was very exciting also moving to New York. I had a lot to look forward to. We lived uptown on Central Park West. Probably couldn't afford to get a place there now, but it was right at the boot of Spanish Harlem. And it was, you know, about a half mile up from the Museum of Natural History. And I remember that my mother, when we moved there, took me to the Museum of Natural History, and I just fell in love with the place. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And I think of it as this example of how she really worked so hard for me, you know, to keep me happy and to help me with this transition. She'd take me up there every day and let me roam around this place for hours and hours, you know. And
in New York, you then returned to school.
Yes, I went to the new school, and I took one class a week in poetry writing class with Pearl London. And then she recommended that I go to graduate school, and I went to NYU to graduate school. And at that time, they didn't have a poetry writing program, so I took literature classes at NYU for several years. You could take one class a semester in graduate school at NYU. That's why I went there instead of Columbia, because at Columbia you had to go full time.
Did you teach in New York?
I got involved with a magazine called New York Quarterly, and through that New York Quarterly I met a group of poets in New Jersey, and they had just started the Poets in the School program in New Jersey, which was a national program that states funded and for poets to go into the school and teach, and that's what I did for many years, 15 years.
When did you start writing?
I started writing really diligently when I moved to New York area, yeah. In fact, even though I was teaching several days a week, as soon as Tony could go to school in the morning, I'd get up and get him off to school and then sit down and write all day long, 6 or 7 hours a day, every day.
You began to send poems out for publication and things at that point?
I would say about 4 or 5 years later, I started to send poems out.
What were you able to explore in your writing when you got away from Detroit?
I really think I might not be alive if I hadn't left Detroit, because my need to do the work I did as a poet was so great, and I don't think I could have done that unless I had left behind my family, because the things I needed to write about were not things that I think I could have done here. I was too attached to my family, and I needed a space of separation. I was able to talk about anger first. It was anger at my father, and then to talk about race and class and color and the ways in which we both saved each other and hurt each other. What I discovered after a long time was that racism was insane. And in order to live in this insane place, we had to think in some crazy ways. And that got enacted in the dramas in families. And I was able to write about that.
How does writing about it enable you to see it differently?
It's really what I always wanted to know. Even when I was young, I told you that I knew that people were suffering, and I always wanted to know why. And I understand why people were suffering the way they were suffering, yeah. I have great compassion for them and great love and respect for the people I grew up with.
So what did it feel like when you had your very first poem published?
I remember I was living in New Jersey. We had a house in Montclair. I had been submitting things for years, and I remember getting this acceptance in the mail, and I started screaming. And I was screaming so loud that the neighbors heard me.
What was that first poem?
Poem number 1. Poem number 1. That's sort of fitting, isn't it? It did make me feel like I was joining a different group, joining the published writers.
And probably even more so the Lotus Press publication of your first book.
Oh, absolutely. Just to take a book and say you have a book, it means a lot.
But it was a very good book, and I was very pleased that it was her first book that we had a chance to publish.
Naomi helped Toi know that it was okay to express her politics in her way, and Toi very much took to that. Toi, I would see sort of a second wave Black writer who then started to move away from a very specific aesthetic of the Black arts movement that allowed African American writers to come from the diaspora of experience, not just geographically, but diaspora of experience, to say, this is me too, this is the Black experience as well.
The first time I heard Daddy by Sylvia Plath, I was 27, 28 years old. And it's not only beautiful, you know, it's a beautiful piece of writing. It's a perfect poem. But what I heard was the fury in that piece, the emotional passion. And it made me see that there were feelings that I felt, that there was a way to express those in a beautiful and meaningful way. And that just clicked like a light bulb for me. The first book was the first time that I took permission from that Sylvia Plath poem to embody rage. And certainly poem number 1 in that book did it. And also to begin to express the unspeakable, the things you weren't supposed to talk about. Beginning to bring forth the subjects that are the difficult subjects to speak of.
The fact that somebody thought so highly of it and published it, and the fact that it was out must have then told you it was all right to do that stuff.
It's always a problem to me, even now, to raise certain issues in the public, because you and I just sitting talking don't talk about certain subjects, and in my writing I am going to talk about those subjects. So it's always a problem, but yes, I saw that it could be done, and I felt validated.
Were you doing readings at the time?
Oh yes. A lot of times very difficult reading. Some of the things that I was talking about were not things that made you feel good to read. You know, after reading, you might feel vulnerable and exposed rather than triumphant or, wow, I'm somebody, I'm reading, you know. A lot of times you'd feel naked and frightened, vulnerable.
I went to a reading when I was about 15 or 16 years old in New York, and Toi took me with her. And it was at a college. And there was a group, very large group, 25, 30 kids there to hear her speak. And I was the only African American that was there. And I was sitting back, and so after it was done, they were all clapping and cheering, and Toi made an introduction, and she introduced me, and she said, "My brother's here." And so they all started looking around to see who in that group was her brother. And when they realized it was me, it was like complete silence. They didn't know that Toi was black. They had all been under the assumption that she was white. And that in itself, to me, at that age, let me know this is what other people see or what other people think. It never occurred to me at that point in my life that she was considered to be white.
And what was the next layer of the onion?
This next book was Natural Birth. And it was about the underlying message of probably all of my books is about the difficulty of being a human being and surviving. And of course that was about birth, but it was specifically, the topic was the birth of my son in a home for unwed mothers. I really didn't talk about the experience to my best friends. It was a secret. You know, and that was the thing. We kept big secrets about our lives. And that's one of the things as a writer that I have just been so opposed to. And that's so much a part of my work, to say we're all humans. We don't have to go around hiding these big parts of our lives from each other. It just causes a lot of pain for everybody. It doesn't help. And I like being friends with other writers and poets because they just tell the darkest secrets of their lives like that. It's no big thing that you got pregnant before you were married, or that you know, even that you were abused or something. It doesn't make you a horrible person to have a life with problems. And I like that. I don't want to have to spend the energy hiding things. It divides you. You need to be doing the good stuff in your life. You don't need to be worrying about who knows and who doesn't know. And I really wanted to capture the realness of the experience of pregnancy and birth in a way that was not a Hallmark greeting card. You know, I wanted to look at the, you know, some of the not too happy feelings that women had about giving birth that a lot of times they didn't want to talk about.
So I read this for Tony, in knowledge of young boys. And this is the last poem in the book. The book is dedicated to him. Natural Birth is called. I knew you before you had a mother, when you were newt-like, swimming a horrible brain in water. I knew you when your connections belonged only to yourself, when you had no history to hook onto, barnacle, when you had no sustenance of metal, when you had no boat to travel, when you stayed in the same place, treading the question. I knew you when you were all eyes and a cocktail, blank as the sky of a mind, a root, neither ground nor placental, not yet red with the cut, nor astonished by pain. One terrible eye open in the center of your head to night turning, and the stars blinked like a cat. We swam in the last trickle of champagne before we knew breast milk. We shared the night of the closet, the parasitic closing on our thumbprint. We were smudged in a yellow book. Son, we were oak without mouth, uncut. We were brave before memory.
He didn't know he had been born in a home for mothers. I never told him because I thought he would feel that I had didn't want him or something, and I never wanted him to know that I had had these confusions about what to do when I became pregnant. So finally the book was written. He was 17. I didn't write it till he was 17 because I think then he went away on an outward bound expedition up in the mountains, and I had a sense that he was independent. And I started writing this book while he was away. And when he came back, I showed him the book. He knew none of this.
She said, I want you to read this if you can. There's going to be some stuff in here that's very painful for you to read. But before I'm comfortable sending it anywhere, it's just a manuscript. I haven't done anything with it. I really want you to read it and let me know if it's all right or if there's anything, you know, you want to tell me about it. And I thought that was pretty remarkable. And now I think it's even more remarkable. At the time I thought, okay, Mom.
And I remember he went upstairs and he came back. He said, Mom, I can't read it all in one sitting, you know. I'll have to read it the next time. And so the next day he came. And when he finished the book, I just knew he was going to say, how could you be this kind of mother? You're just terrible that you would think of giving me up. You know, I hate you. And he came down and he said, Mom, I just had no idea you suffered like that.
And there is some heavy stuff in there, you know. She talks about, you know, looking at me and seeing how I look like, you know, I was too black, and, you know, she wanted to change my facial features, and she resented me, and, you know, all the stuff that you'd expect because she's honest. It's kind of weird, but I got it. And I gladly gave her permission to do that and anything else that was honest. And but I think for me, it was just another day. It was my first window into that type of work for her. So I started seeing more and more what was going on inside of her as a person and what she needed to get out creatively. And she got sort of a license from me to do that.
That's what he said. Great compassion And he's like that. He has a great heart for others. And he's just a great artist. He's a musician. I really think he's a poet. Don't tell anybody I said that, you know. But I think he's a poet. He writes great poetry. And the best thing about Tony is his children love him so much. He's been such a good father. He's very special. When I was at NYU, and I was in a graduate school, I think in graduate school about 10 years. But finally, toward the end, I was in the creative writing program, and Galway Cannell was my teacher, and Phil Levine, and Louis Simpson, Yehuda Amichai. These were my teachers.
Phil Levine, fellow Detroiter.
Yes, that's right. That's right. We were friends. I was friends with all of my teachers because I was a lot older than the other students, and I'd published 2 books by then. I spoke to Galway Cannell about being the only African American and the problems that I had run into in my graduate classes. And he and I talked about, he asked me to come up with a program that might address this. And so I proposed for NYU to have a program where African American high school students would come in and stay in the dorms for a week in the summer and study with poets. And we presented it, the 2 of us presented it to the head of the department. It didn't go very far. In the 3rd book, in Captivity, I started to be able to talk about race. That was a dangerous subject because at that time I never studied a black poet in grade school, high school, college, graduate school. And I knew that that was the subject that a lot of the people that I had studied with and who I respected as poets, they did not want black people writing about what it was like to be black. That wasn't going to be a popular subject.
I had the good fortune to study with Arna Bontemps, and I was taking some classes, but my advisor told me it was thin material and I shouldn't be taking it. And that was the attitude.
I was told when I asked in one of my advising professors, you know, why I hadn't read any African American poets, he said, we don't go down that low. So yeah, it wasn't. And even you know, in the mid '90s, there was a chancellor at the Academy of American Poets said that black poets can't be universal until they stop writing about race. Now, and on another level too, among black poets, it was all right, but in the 60s, in the Black is Beautiful and the Black Arts movement, you know, there was a certain perspective that was absolutely necessary, and that was the idea that we are strong, we are powerful, we are beautiful. This was an absolutely essential message to pass on. But I was needing to say things that were not about all of the ways in which we were beautiful.
What you wanted to address was not what was acceptable at the time.
I had to sort of make my way to find the places where it was acceptable, where I would be confirmed for doing that. And as I say, Audre Lorde, certainly Gwendolyn Brooks, Robert Hayden, these were people that I could emulate. And
some people suffered.
Naomi.
Many people suffered. Robert Hayden, Naomi. I think of several people who suffered because they weren't doing the accepted thing at the time.
That's right.
You felt that strongly at the time.
I was constantly trying to find my way through this.
Captivity, which is the first book we did, is my favorite. Not because I think it's necessarily better than other things she's done. I don't think it is. But it's because that's when I first knew her, and that's when I first saw those poems. She looks at the stuff. She's a very careful craftsperson, I think. So in that way, from my point of view, it's great because she shows up with a manuscript that is very doable and very readable, and it doesn't require a great deal of my work. I can't ask for, for much more than that.
I sent Captivity to Ed Ochester, I think in '86 or maybe '87, and I got back a really great letter from him saying that he really liked the book and I should try it again. It was for the prize. There's a prize that Pitt gave, and it had a different title. It was called Red Angel then, and then the next year I submitted it again and he accepted it.
I was delighted with Toi's work. I really liked it when I first heard it. I liked it when I read it. That was the reason that I did it. But I also said, oh boy, this is someone, who probably is going to find an audience pretty quickly.
I met him at an AWP conference.
For some reason, I'm not sure why, I heard her do either a lecture to undergraduate students or a reading for undergraduates there. And the kids loved her. She interacted with them very well. I loved what I heard. And it just happened that we had a space open in the English department at that time. So when I came back, I was telling people about this young woman at Old Dominion who I thought was really extremely good.
He suggested that I apply for it.
We eventually offered her a job, and she came. And it was around that time that we did her first book, which I was very interested in doing.
I think I took a year off. I had a chair at George Mason for a year, and then I went to Pitt after that. So it must have been '90.
Began a totally new phase of your life, really.
Absolutely, and living in Pittsburgh. And during that time, my marriage was dissolving, and it was hard, very hard. But Bruce had gotten a job in D.C., and we had lived in D.C. for a while, and that's why I was teaching at George Mason. And he continued to live there until he died. And we separated in '90. I think we were still hanging in there until '95 or so, and then I made a permanent separation at that point.
This idea of sort of what's on the edge of your vision, the edge of your thought, the edge of society, those margins, that sort of where the line is, and then Toi just looks around, she looks past that margin, she looks right around that edge, and she's able to express what's there.
In the first book that you did with us, Captivity, there's a wonderful poem about a teenager who lures a stray dog over a cliff just for the thrill of killing the dog. And it's the same kind of sympathy with the helpless and with the lonely that exists in all of her work, I think. It's not always there toward the front, but it's always there.
I am thinking about that boy who bragged about the day he threw a dog over and watched it struggle to stay upright all the way down. I am thinking of that rotting carcass on the rocks. And the child with such power, he could call to a helpless thing as if he were its friend, capture it, and think of the cruelest punishment. It must have answered some need, some silent screaming in a closet, a motherless call when night came crashing. It must have satisfied, for he seemed joyful, proud, as if he had once made a great creation out of murder. That body on the rocks, its sharp angles slowly took the shape of what was underneath. Bones pounded until it lay on the bottom like a scraggly rug. Nothing remains but memory and the suffering of those who would walk into the soft hands of a killer for a crumb of bread.
She reads beautifully, and I think it's so important for a poet to learn how to read with expression. And she certainly does, and she makes the poems come alive.
If you're talking about her sense of humor, there's a poem in that book about Allen Ginsberg taking a pee in the gutter after being rejected by a woman in a local bookstore who refused to let him use the bathroom there. It's a very funny poem. It's not just an amusing poem, it also says something about the way that we view celebrities if we know that they are celebrities. That's a wonderful poem, I think. And there are many others like this in that book and in the other books too. But I think when I come back to it, if I'm introducing students, for example, to Toi's work, I will tend to come back to Captivity, and I will tend to start with those two poems and then read others from the book, I think. But with Toi, you could almost put your finger any place in any volume, and it would work.
The craft is the most important thing for any poet, and she stays very close to the bone, and she's not afraid to admit frailty or humanity. I love the poem, particularly Black Bottom, which talks about how the residents of Conant Garden, the black middle class, the light-skinned and more entitled people in the African American community would go to Black Bottom as a kind of entertainment to watch the street life. And she talks about snickering, and then she talks about how it tore them down to the human. That the contact, because I think one of her biggest themes is that despite everything, our humanity is what unites us.
When relatives came from out of town, we would drive down to Black Bottom, drive slowly down the congested main streets, Beaubien and Hastings, trapped in the mesh of Saturday night. Freshly escaped black middle class, we snickered and were proud. The louder the streets, the prouder. We laughed at the bright clothes of a prostitute, a man sitting on a curb with a bottle in his hand. We smelled barbecue cooking in dented washtubs, and our mouths watered. As much as we wanted it, we couldn't take the chance. Rhythm and blues came from the windows, the throaty voice of a woman lost in the bass, in the drums, in the dirty down and out, the grind. I love to see a funeral, then I know it ain't mine. We rolled our windows down so that the waves rolled over us like blood. We hoped to pass invisibly, knowing on Monday we would return safely to our jobs, the post office and classroom. We wanted our sufferings to be offered up as tender meat and our triumphs to be belted out in raucous song. We had lost our voice in the suburbs, in Conant Gardens, where each brick house delineated a fence of silence. We had lost the right to sing in the street and damn creation. We returned to wash our hands of them, to smell them whose very existence tore us down to the human.
Well, Toi was the first writer, first poet I ever truly met. After college, when I was thinking about going overseas and playing basketball and maybe pursuing a degree in painting, a professor essentially said, you should try writing. So I applied to a few schools. One of them was the University of Pittsburgh, and right around the time I was trying to decide if it was something I was really going to do, Toi showed up in South Carolina where I was. And so I had a chance to talk to her and figure out what this future might look like. And she was just so engaging and so warm, is that, you know, pretty much after meeting her, I decided that I would come to a city that I knew very little about beyond the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so I literally met her, and she's just, from that moment when I was a senior in college to this moment, has always been sort of just that kind of guide, the person I look to when I'm thinking about, you know, poetry and what it means to be a poet.
We knew that she would be a wonderful teacher. We knew that she would be a kind of sort of center of energy and direction for the creative writing program, which she was. We knew that she was a person, I mean, one of the ways that I think of Toi's teaching is that she makes things possible. She makes the occasion for people to do good and interesting work. She puts them in the presence of other interesting poets and people, and she did that for undergraduates, for the graduate program. We have a series called the Contemporary Writers Series. We bring writers to campus throughout the academic year. Toi brought some knockout people in, so we knew all of that. I didn't know anything about Cave Canem until she started to talk to me about the work that she and Cornelius Eady were doing, and that, I mean, that is a major program. That is a program that has made a difference in the lives of African American poets, but really it's made a difference to American poetry.
I met Cornelius Eady and his wife Sarah Micklin at a week-long residential poetry workshop where we were teaching in the early 90s.
We just bonded immediately. I mean, you know, Toi and my wife Sarah and I just sort of just fell together.
There were some things that had happened where we taught, where there was a distinct sense of discomfort around the African American poets who had come to that workshop. And these were some of my students that I had brought from Pitt.
Independently, we started thinking about, you know, what that meant. You know, there was that when African Americans are in that kind of a location, this is about writing, and you're told to, you know, tell the truth and write what you know. Well, sometimes what African Americans know is, you know, painful stuff, you know, about this country, right? And if saying that and writing that puts you in some sort of jeopardy, or makes you feel like you're odd and out of it, well then, you know, maybe that's the wrong location for it. Maybe there should be a space that basically you don't have to explain or defend yourself just for bringing in something that's an Afrocentric or African American centric, or just your life, you know, and putting it down on the page.
And we shared a lot of the same concerns about the lack of African Americans in literature programs and in writing programs, and the lack of African American teachers in these programs as well. I felt very trusting of them as people that I could share some of my own angst about being this only black professor in these programs that I've visited and taught in.
How did the two of you hit upon Cave Canem as a way to deal with those problems?
The next summer, Cornelius and Sarah and I went to Capri to vacation for a couple weeks together. We had a wonderful time. And during that time, I asked them if they would be interested in having a week retreat for African American poets, and they said they would be very interested. And I said, well, where are we going to get funding? I've tried to get funding in the past. And Sarah said, well, let's just do it out of our own pockets. And then as soon as she said this, I remembered my friend who was a priest, Father Gargani, was a retreat director at a monastery on the Hudson River, and he had always said, if you ever want to use the monastery.
We called him directly from Italy and said, guess what, we have this great idea, are you up? And he said, this is great, let's do it.
One thing led to another, just one thing opened up after another. It was almost like it just had to happen. We got 65 applicants for 20 spaces, and we had a place, and we told everybody they had to pay room and board, but we did not charge tuition. I had just met Elizabeth Alexander and a Fa Weaver I had known from New Jersey, and I knew they'd teach for nothing. And so I called them, and they said, sure, we'll teach for nothing.
But it came from that feeling, that need, that there need to be some safe space where I can simply just talk about the craft and the art that we all love, that brings us all together, right?
We had gone to Pompeii when we were in Capri, and I noticed on the floor of the house of the tragic poet was the first Beware the Dog, Cave Canem, which is the black dog on a leash. And Sarah is a graphic designer, so she did our logo from that, but she broke the leash of the dog. And that's how the name Cave Canem, we're right from Pompeii,
It confuses a lot of people, right? Because it's Latin, because it's a black dog, so I can't imagine, it's kind of ironic to think that two poets couldn't think about the imagery, the symbolic imagery of having a black dog, fun. But at that moment, we thought we were only thinking about it as safe space, right? Safe space being patrolled by this dog, which is the organization, and it still makes sense.
The people who are a part of it need it so much that it's gonna happen. Nobody's gonna stop it. It's needed.
So it's been going about 20 years now. How did it get funded so that it's institutionalized?
Well, for many years we didn't even ask for funding. I remember there was a question about somebody offered us stamps, and we said, should we take them or not? I don't know, and we finally decided not to take stamps, We didn't want to be co-opted in any way. We wanted this to be something that we did and we were in charge of.
On the first night of every Cave Canem retreat, there's the storytelling of how I got here.
And we asked, why are you here? And people just broke down,
They talk about their families that said, get a real job. They talk about MFA programs that tried to twist them into something that they weren't. They talk about struggling to be a writer in a world that's so foreign. And so that story of how I got there, I think, is a story that resonates for a seasoned writer, African-American writer in particular, looking for a home, as well as a young person in Detroit that's looking for that emotional and intellectual safe place.
And you felt the power of this circle of people, some of whom had never seen another African-American poet, never worked with another. For people to look across the room and know that they were sitting in this place with all of these great writers, it just made them look at themselves in a different way. It broke your heart, and it just made you ecstatic at the same time. It was so beautiful.
Galvanizes them, charges them up, excites them about the idea of the possibilities of African American poetry. That isn't just one thing. It isn't some monolithic one voice that sounds exactly the same. That there's so many different layers within the African American poetic. That there's so many ways that people are expressing themselves within that poetic, that it really becomes transformative.
When you think about what it means to be an artist, I think there's on one hand very little people can do, because you can't really manufacture talent. I think that talent is a kind of innate thing, but what you do with that talent definitely can be shaped, and I think that that's part of what the space represents, what Cave Canem represents. I mean, you have to be talented to get here, and then once you're here, you see sort of the possibilities that talent offers.
They can keep going because they know that we're around. In the back of your mind, they know, in their minds, they know that there's this location called Cave Canem, and we see them and we know who they are, and we know what they're up to, and we're tracking them, and they're tracking each other. Suddenly they've got a lifeboat.
Next poet, Mary Moore Easter, you all. Give it up for Mary Moore.
Good evening. Cave Canem has been good to me. I'm going to read 2 poems I wrote here last year that were published in the April issue of Poetry magazine.
Thomas won a Whiting. Major Jackson, who won the Cave Canem Book Award, also won a Whiting. Tracy K. Smith is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. Natasha Trethewey, who also won the book award, the Cave Canem Book Award. You know, she's the poet laureate. Yusuf Kumanyaka, he teaches at NYU, Pulitzer Prize winner. It goes on, and even the younger people are like making strides. So we're everywhere, doing big things.
Such a significant and such a valuable institution. They call it the home for Black poets, and it is indeed that. Nobody else thought to do that. Nobody else. There are other workshops, but this is the main one that has been so very helpful to poets. And they used to meet in Cranbrook, which was near Detroit. And on certain evenings, other poets would read, and I remember reading there.
First 3 or 4 years was in upstate New York. Then we went to Cranbrook for 3 or 4 years, 5 years, and now we're here.
Still self-standing?
No, we did get funding finally.
We weren't really thinking about this huge thing called Cave Canem. We were thinking about a workshop, small thing that would just keep going, and how can we keep it going?
I cannot tell you how much work it has taken from so many people, so many dedicated people. But it's almost like at the right moment, the right person comes, the right thing happens. It's just supposed to happen.
And for a lot of the faculty that have come through Cave Canem, many times it would be that they have never taught a workshop of strictly African American writers, ever. And suddenly there they are, and that changes, and that transforms them. That's transformative. They realize that they were missing that. They didn't know what they were missing until they got here, right?
I've watched Cave Canem evolve a little because I'm on the board there, and it's been very interesting to watch Toi evolve the organization and her role in the organization, and to observe what its not just what its impacts have been. Clearly, they've created a dramatically important organization with great impact, but similar to the way she engages a poem, I guess, the recognition of what needs to change and what needs to continue, and trying to confront what it doesn't matter what needs to change in some ways. Those change. People can imagine their way into the change, but imagining your way into what should continue and how to make what should continue endure through the change is what she really is focused on.
I'm gonna take a couple more.
Make us laugh, please.
All right, you just all won the Nobel Prize. For what?
Chemistry.
Every day with love, love, love. Last one. 1, 2, 3.
Tinder. I actually wrote one of these poems in Detroit. I was at a restaurant in Detroit on Woodward, right around Wayne State. I was at a restaurant there, and I heard this person in the next booth say this poem and I just wrote it down. The tenderest meat comes from the houses where you hear the least squealing. The secret is to give a little wine before killing. And it wasn't exactly like that because I've added cadence to it and line break and everything, but it was that. And I thought, hey, there's a poem, an overheard poem.
Has that happened very often where you...
No, almost never. But it probably could if I would just have my ears open a little better. I guess it was written during the 90s, most of them. This was, I would say, the book that was most all written around the same time. More about family, more about class, and I began to explore the actual violence that happened in my childhood. But tender, is three things. Tender is, you feel tender, but it's also somebody that takes care of others is a tender, but also it's money. And so it starts with that poem about Elmina Castle when I visited Africa and went to the place where they actually held the slaves before they went out on the ships. And the thing that was the most shocking thing was the door of no return, which is very narrow. So people must have had been starved. They must have been this paper thin to go through it. But it was so they would only go out one at a time so that they couldn't mutiny. It was like a poem in that it was both beautiful and horrible at the same time. When I was in, the structure itself had aesthetics. It was, at the very top there was a church. At the top was a church with the lintel in the church said, "This is the house of God." And, the slaves were down in the dungeon. It's just this amazing, what is it? Two forces being in the same moment in time for you to experience both the brutality of something and the aesthetics of it.
And so you're working on the Black Notebook still during this time, and they were to come out soon.
I started that in 1973. And it was published in 1997. So, and I really hadn't sent it out. It was just a work in progress all during those years. That had been a very, very long process because I started when I moved to Upper Montclair, New Jersey. And I recorded in a book that I was in a suicidal depression about moving into this all-white neighborhood. I sort of got what I wanted turned out to be my worst nightmare. But I say in the book that I wanted to know what was it about myself that I wanted to kill. And that was what that book was exploring, what was so deeply hated in me. And I used the metaphor of my own blackness. And that was the metaphor for the book, but it's really about self-loathing and where that comes from.
How did you know it was finished?
When I sent it to Norton, they accepted it right away, and it felt almost right, but not exactly right. And I wrote the introduction, and it wouldn't be the book it is without the introduction, because the introduction really contains the lesson that I learned in 25 years of writing the book, and it provides a kind of lens to look at the book through. And so that was an absolutely essential part. And when that was done, I was done. I knew it was over. If you don't mind, I'd read it right now because I think this speaks to this. And it just says, W.E.B. Du Bois speaks of double consciousness. For me, it isn't double, but many, many consciousnesses within. I say in one section of this book that I was watching the world as if I were looking through the eyes of the most vicious racist. You know, I had to look at my work through the eyes of the most vicious racist and how they would read it. But I was also looking through the eyes of white literary critics, black literary critics, of light-skinned black women and dark-skinned black women, of middle class and poor. Every one of the things I wrote, I was looking at it from all of these different perspectives and trying to find the way to say it that could get it past these censors that people put up in regard to this topic of race. I was looking through the eyes of my mother, cousins, and aunts. I've had to find a way not only to go around competing and repressive voices. So it wasn't just, oh, well, I won't write what that guy, doesn't want me to write. But to address them, to listen and record them, to disarm them, and bring them to another perspective, to resolve conflicting aims. So every word in this book has been passed through many layers of consciousness and me. And I think this is true of people who have suffered, that there are all of these internal voices where they are constantly evaluating language and seeing it as this organic thing with many layers, and then they're deciding what language to use to either get through that or around it, or, certainly this is what I learned as I was growing up that a black person had to do. You had to be watchful.
Especially given the experiences you had, because there had been breakthroughs, there had been the black arts, poetry movement, and so on, but none of them made spaces for what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I did. I wanted to make a space where it was safe to write about anything.
So it's like 20 years in the making and 200 pages. How much writing actually went into it?
Yeah. A 4-drawer file. No, I'm serious. Stuffed so that you couldn't get another page in all 4 drawers. That was maybe 1/3 of the drafts. I was on a panel with Natalie Goldberg, who wrote Writing Down the Bones, and we were supposed to talk about the process of writing. So I just took in a carton of pages, and it was about, this, I could hardly carry it. And I put it up on the table, and I was just going to open pick up and say, yeah, this is the process of writing. And she came over, and she peered in, and she looked at that. She said, what a nightmare. And it was. It was a nightmare.
It was a New York Times pick. It was on their Christmas list. It hit to a large public in a way that many works by poets do not.
I was afraid my reader was going to hate me, because the book is a lot about shame, about my shame. And I thought, I'm just going to be hated for saying the things that I'm saying in this book. So I got a prize. Somebody called me and told me I had a prize, and I said, no, I didn't. And they said, yeah, you got a prize. No, I really didn't believe that people would read that book and think I was worthy of anything.
For some writers, the work is in lineation and how many syllables hit a line. And for some writers, the work is in, do I really believe what I have said? And so even when it looks like a conversation, the revision is really to get to truth. The revision is not to get to math.
It was written in iambic pentameter for many years, and as a poem, because one of my struggles is always about form. What is the form you're going to use? Is it going to be a poem? Is it going to look like a prose? Because it's not about form as an absolute. It's about, what do you want the form to do for what you're writing? What is its job? And the reason why it's not in iambic pentameter is I finally decided that the purpose of form was to enable the reader to feel comfortable when they open the book and to think, she just took these out of her journal. I want people to read that book and think, oh, she didn't struggle with this for 20 years. These are just her journal writing, because I don't want them to be intimidated by form. You know how you look at a poem and you say, oh, that's a poem. Some people are very intimidated by that. They think, oh, I won't understand that. Because it's a poem, I don't understand poetry.
I don't know about most of your students, but most of mine are exactly like that.
Yeah.
They don't like poetry.
Well, the subject of race makes people skittish anyway. They feel like, oh, I'm not going to, what are they going to want me to feel when I read this? Am I supposed to feel guilty now, or stupid, or, am I going to get mad because it's a touchy subject? I didn't want any of that. It's a personal story, just something I wrote out of my journal. Just feel easy about this when you enter into it. And that's the way people feel. And so the form is appropriate. Now, the thing that happened that was disconcerting to me was when I sent it to W.W. Norton, the final version of it, and I got back the galleys, it was entirely different than the lines that I had in mind when I sent the manuscript. Because to them, when they got it, it looked like prose. It just was, prose. But to me, it was lines with certain words on it. Because for a poet, a line represents what information I want you to receive here in this line, in what period of time, so your brain is processing. I mean, that's what a line does in a poem. You take in a certain kind of information, it takes this long, then you go to the next amount of it. That's how I had structured the book, by lines.
How did you resolve that?
It wasn't resolved. I mean, I guess if I had been a really famous writer, like, E.L. Doctorow or something, I would say, no, you can't publish this book. But no, I was happy that it would. But now reading it, it's not, the timing is much faster than I intended the timing to be in the reading of the book. It doesn't read the way my manuscript read.
Isn't it interesting how the white counterculture movements throughout time have always had this kind of romantic, idealized notion of black folks? Mm-hmm. Like they would go and want to hang around the jazz cabarets, and the Harlem Renaissance people were in vogue and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Have you felt that kind of pressure at times too, when people admire black artists for, quote, the wrong things?
Yeah. Yeah, you can't do black. There's no way to do it the right way. Seriously, if you're too light is a problem, if you're too dark is a problem, if you're medium colored, you can't do black right. There's always something you have to watch out for. And solicitous white people are something that you sometimes have to watch out for.
You can't do black right. It's been at the core of your work all the time, hasn't it? People, you're struggling with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that part of what's terrifying?
That you can't do it right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I guess deep down there were a lot of people were telling me that I was supposed to do it right, whatever the it was. Catholicism, blackness, woman. Yeah, there was always a way to do it right, and I was looking for it, I guess, yeah.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. So that's not just me, you know. Other people feel these things too.
And it was May 2004 when we had the first meeting about City of Asylum with a group of people to talk about, is it doable? Is it interesting? What do you think? And Toi was there in that first group, and she's been with us ever since.
We started with a really simple mission, which was to provide sanctuary to writers exiled under threat of persecution.
Our first writer was an exiled Chinese poet who had had a really brutal time in his life, and in China for writing poetry. And Toi, really in the very beginning of meeting him, could not get over how joyful he was. And she wrote a line that's now the prologue to a poem in The Undertaker's Daughter, and the line is, "Joy is an act of resistance." And so she understands things in a very profound way, and saying to maintain your joy is something. Your body can be beaten, you can be confined, all of these terrible things, you can be marginalized in the worst possible way. But if you maintain your joy, you've still got something. So she gave us, as another gift, a way of looking at life and looking at our writers. And we're now using the line and collaborating with Toi on a public work.
Initially, this kind of energy of the Chinese writer and some of the events began to engage people in a deeper way, which we began to understand but didn't quite know what was happening. And Toi was able to frame and explain to us in a way that only someone who's deeply both in touch with the process and can, just with words and the ability to express what was actually happening. And it changed our mission, changed what we do at City of Asylum, and began to communicate in a much more articulated way to the various community members and other artists what we were all about. And that was one of those epiphanies that, you know, you look back and you say, where were we? And she made it happen.
Right. It takes a lot of time to teach. It takes a lot of time to found Cave Canem and keep Cave Canem going. And it takes a lot of time to be involved in City of Asylum. And Toi gives the gift of her brilliance, and her articulation as only Toi can, but she also gives a gift of time to make something better. And she's trying to make the poets, her student poets, better. She's trying to make marginal voices heard. And she's trying to make City of Asylum better, which is also presenting marginal voices. So that's a huge gift to individuals and to humanity.
Your most recent book, The Undertaker's Daughter, in that book, the two important characters are your mother and father. And was that book years in the making?
And me, don't forget.
And, oh, of course, and you, yeah.
I guess it must have taken me all my life to write that for some reason. I mean, the Black Notebooks was very difficult to write, but I guess I really couldn't get that close to home literally, until, you know, this age where I could see it more clearly.
Is this you, or is it a constructed speaker in this book?
It's always a constructed speaker when it's done, when it's finished. Everything has two sides working at the same time, and if you let yourself skate when you're writing about shame and self-loathing, you're gonna skate. you're not going to deal with the issue. So it was very important for me to be scrupulous. However, when you're constructing a book, a story is a story, and it's my story, and it's the way I remember it at this moment in time. You can't, go to court on it. And sometimes things change. I mean, you record it one way in 1990, but then if you write it again in 2000, something may change. Not that you lied, but just your memory changes. So it's always constructed. You would think that one treated so cruelly would kill the abuser, throw him out of the brain forever. What a horrific irony that the abuser is the one most taken in, most remembered. The imprint of those who were loving and kind is secondary, like a passing cloud. Sometimes I thought that's why my father beat me, because he was afraid he would be forgotten, and he achieved what he wanted. In the deepest place of judgment, not critical thinking, not on that high plane, but judgment of the first waking, judgment of the sort that decides what inner face to turn to me this morning, in that first choosing moment of what to say to myself, that place from which first language blossoms. I choose, must choose my father's words. The twisted snarl of his unbelief turned everything good into something undeserved, so that nothing convinces enough, no man or woman or child, no play or work of art. There is no inner loyalty, no way of belonging. I cannot trust what I feel and connect to. I cannot love or hold anything in my hand, any fragile thing. A living blue egg? My own baby? In the same way, I never convinced my father I was his, and I must rest on it as on bedrock. I loved him more than anyone. I wanted to please him. I wanted to say the right things and make him happy, but I was also terrified that I'd make him so unhappy and so angry that he'd strike me and kill me. So I was just in this terrible prison where I couldn't go either way. And it was the most awful feeling. I remember it well. So in some ways, coming to words about my childhood and that experience was breaking through.
What does the letting go mean to you now as you look at this and sing it?
It means I have my own life, that I'm free. I'm free of the past in many ways. We're never free, but of a lot of the torture that I did to myself, I am free. I truly am. And the last section. Afterward, I hear in myself a slight opposition, a wounded presence saying, I am me, I know who I am. But I am left with only a narrow hole, a thin tube that the words must squeak through. Where words might have gushed as from a struck well, now instead I watch it, watch every word.
Has anyone ever put you in the group with confessional poets?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't care, sure, that's good. It's certainly, it's pejorative, it's after the fact. They decide you fit over there. But it's not just about sharing my painful childhood with you. you know, a work of art reveals itself to you. You don't know what it is. If you know what it is, it's not art. You have to not know where you're going. And sometimes it takes a long time to figure that out because, you know, your ego may not want what the piece of art wants. Sometimes you're in conflict. And you have to let the art take over and tell you what it wants to do. And I think as you gain skills as a writer, certainly I can make decisions a lot faster now than I used to be able to make about where the art is. But still, it's still up to the art.
And I'm not sure that she's ever sure what she's going to write. You know, she's open to suggestions. She doesn't edit herself a lot. Well, it's knowing the process. It also is trusting yourself in a way.
I think poets are hard to live with. I think they're all married to the muse a little bit.
This is why Plato banished them from the Republic, right?
It's a good reason. Has anybody ever loved a fish? Tell the truth. If you've ever loved a fish, raise your hand. There's at least 6 people in the audience. For all of you that haven't. They're smart, these guys. All right. The poem starts with an epigraph. Joy is an act of resistance. And I'll repeat that. Joy is an act of resistance. For Telly the fish. Telly's favorite artist was Alice Neal. When he first came to my house, I propped up her bright yellow shade with open window and a vase of flowers postcard size behind his first fishbowl. I thought it might give him something to look at, like the center of a house you keep coming back to, a hearth, a root for your eye. It was a wondering in me that came up with that thought, a kind of empathy across my ear and through his water, maybe the first word that I propped up between us in case he could hear. Telly would stare at that painting for hours, hanging there with his glassy eyes wide open. At night, he wanted the bottom as if it were a warm bed. He'd lay there sort of dreaming, his eyes gray and dim and thoughtless. For months, he came back to her the way a critic or lover can build a whole lifetime on the long study of one great work. I don't know why he stopped. Maybe it was when he first noticed me, the face above my hand, feeding, for sometimes when I'd set the food on top, he'd still watch me eye to eye as if saying, food isn't enough. Once, when I bent, he jumped out of the water and kissed my lips. What is a fish's kiss like? You'd think it would be cold, slimy, but it was quick, nippy, hard. Maybe it was just what I expected. With all our fears of touch, it takes so long to learn how to take in. When he stopped coming to the top, I guess I did all the wrong things. The fish medicine that smelled, measured carefully for his ounce of weight, for his gills worked so hard, and he lay still, tipped over slightly, like a dead boat. How do you stop the hurt of having to breathe? After, I took him to the middle of the yellow bridge right near the Andy Warhol Museum. I had put a paper towel in a painted egg and laid him in it. And at the top, I opened the casket and emptied him out into the water.
When I read that the first time, I said, oh, for God's sake, we've got to get rid of this. And then I read it a second and a third time. I said, no, that's exactly what she wants. This is exactly what Toi is doing. This is exactly what she's representing. And it was interesting to me when I was talking to some people about the book when it first came out, that they were struck by that also. And her friend and former student, Terrance Hayes, said to me, you know, despite my original view of it, he said, that stuff that she's doing with the goldfish is really something new. You know, this is a daring kind of thing that she's doing. And I think so too.
Well, students often say, why does the literature we read in our classes has to be so somber and sad and so on? And even in the midst of the most serious things, you do bring humor. Telly the Fish in this book,
yeah.
Allen Ginsberg in one of the others. You like that, don't you?
Yes, I do.
You like to mix
and
the
I
humor.
like in my new work, there's a lot of it. The comic in me really is coming out more and more and more. And yes, I do like it. It's just a way of jerking reality around a little bit and making it do something that's fun. I like to have fun sometimes when I write, and certainly the Telly poems were fun for me, but they were also very scary to write. I mean, when you're writing a love poem to a fish, and I thought, oh, this is pretty stupid here, and I'm going to publish this. But actually, people love Telly, and it's cute to see that people identify. I think there is a poem in there that talks about the audience yelling, "Viva Telly! Telly lives!" I mean, they really love Telly. I think a lot of writers like to write an animal poem now and then. Animals are, I think, spiritual guides.
When I read The Undertaker's Daughter, I realized she hasn't peaked. She is still ascending.
She was just elected to the Board of Chancellors of the Academy of American Poets, which is a great honor, I think.
I mean, that to me was a great indication that people have been paying attention and finally acknowledged the contribution she's been doing all along to American letters.
I don't know how much of the poetry world is known outside of the poetry world, but within the poetry world, she's really major.
Toi wanted to make things possible for other people, that it wasn't for her just about her career and its advancement. It was about advancing poetry. It was about advancing a kind of idea of what poetry could do, and particularly for the African American community. Well, she was, she came to us as a gift and passed it on to everybody who followed her.
You just retired, you're professor emeritus. Your time is now your own for writing, and so what's up now? What's next?
Well, I don't exactly know yet because it's been such a very busy time. I broke my knee, which is the hardest bone in the body to break, the patella. And so recuperating from this, I decided to, rather than to move to Florida, I was down there for a couple winters, I decided to buy a condo in Pittsburgh and completely renovate it, sell my house, get rid of everything I own just about. And so that's been a big change. I've changed a relationship. I had a very long-term relationship that just kind of fell apart. I have a new manuscript now, Journal for a Fractured Knee. And I wrote 250 pages. This is really about mortality and about what happens when you don't have the same resources you had before. As you age, you just can't do the things you did before. You're not physically capable. Maybe you don't even want to do it anymore. Your focus changes, your need to take care of yourself, to use your resources in a way that recognizes your own mortality. And I like this very much. It feels a way of rebalancing myself in a more where I have more choice and control over what my options are. Now that I know I can't do everything, then I'm going to do this and sort of do it in a more conscious way. I feel a exuberance and a joy and a power that, not physical, but a mental and an emotional power, sort of like a way of connecting to myself that I haven't had before.
I wonder if it will make you write less or more.
I wonder too.
Yeah,
because I was thinking, hey, you know, sometimes people are done. They say, oh, I did that. Now I'm going to go sit in the sun or...
Well, I'm wondering how many times before, when you were working on things, you had to make sacrifices in order to work on them, and now you might say, I'm not going to sacrifice anymore. It's my time.
One thing I realized is that I've worked all my life now to have enough money to be my own patron. I'm like Rilke having the Countessa who supported him while he went up into the castle and lived 10 years until he wrote the Duino Elegies, you know. So I'm my own Countessa. So, hey, I can lay around the castle today. Maybe I can invite a friend over. I'll write poems tomorrow. And I get to choose. I get to do that because my Contessa has some money in the bank that I worked all my life for.
We've talked about how there were all these different stages focusing around a book. All right, will you think of the next thing as a book, or might you write individual things just for the fun of it? Who knows?
Who knows? I have, in my computer right now, I have about 6 things that I write into, large topics that I write into. We'll see where they go.
Yes, well, when you have the time to yourself now, you have to start thinking, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want to be remembered for?
What do I want to be remembered for? I guess Cave Canem. Yeah, I guess Cave Canem. That I was part of that group of people. I hope people will turn to my work and find it useful. But if somebody says, you know, some of the great poets of Cave Canem and Toi was there with them, you know, that would be good. It really does feel good. I feel like I've been of use. And I think that's just such a gift to me, you know, that I've been able to do that. I think about that all the time, how many gifts I've received that have helped me along my way. Just kindness and generosity of people. Then I couldn't have done the things I've done, the writing and the teaching and the Cave Canem, you know, without people. And, I don't know why I get to have all these wonderful things that have happened in my life, but I'm very grateful.
There's no end to the things I will do for you. So much love to give. Help me work my problems out. Give me the strength, let them show. You best believe you can lend a helping hand. Lovely on your own. You don't need nobody else. It's pronounced with a sigh. Every time you walk by, lovely by yourself. And when you're on your own, then I know you so well. 'Cause the love that you give is your reason to live.